I have a couple of goals for what I want us to achieve. Oh, wait a minute. Review. I was looking at the wrong screen. So I have a couple of goals for the presentation this afternoon. The first thing I want to do is just talk about what autism spectrum disorder is, how you get a diagnosis on the spectrum, what that means in terms of a condition. I'm going to talk a little bit about what we know about autism, causes, treatments, things like that. And then I'm going to spend a decent amount of time talking about how the characteristics of autism are most commonly manifested in educational settings like college. This comes not only from my clinical experience, but also from the fact that here at the Burkhart Center for the last going on 8 years now, we've run one of the only formal support programs for degree-seeking college students on the spectrum in the country. For the last 7+ years, we're supporting students on the spectrum who are at Tech and at South Plains College here in town to earn degrees, to survive the dorms, and learn how to navigate the college environment. And so I'm going to use my experience working with our program here to talk about some of the things we've seen as fairly consistent struggles for our students and the things that we know university staff and those who work with those students can do to help set them up for success in what can be kind of an overwhelming college environment for everybody. Just as a quick reminder, by the way, please mute your microphone if you haven't already, just to avoid us getting echoes or, you know, hearing your dog bark to go outside or whatever it might be. That'll just help everyone be able to hear a little better. Thank you very much. As I said before, feel free to ask questions. This is your presentation. I will happily, you know, babble on about everything we do here at the Burkhart Center and how cool I think college students with autism are. I can talk for hours and hours and days and tell lots and lots of stories. But fundamentally, the reason you're here is to learn how to be successful with students with autism on your campus and in your culture and your climate. So I want you to help me make this presentation something that's the most useful for you. Because of that, I want it to be participatory throughout. You don't have to wait until the end to ask your questions. I have more slides than I can possibly cover because I never know what audience will want to talk about what aspects of this. So I will spend time where you want to spend time and discuss the issues you want to discuss. Once we get out of the here's what autism is slides, and we start talking about how those characteristics manifest in higher ed and what we know about post-secondary experiences, that's your opportunity to tell me what struggles are you're facing, what questions you have, what are the things I can do to hopefully offer some helpful advice, give some tips for folks that you're working with. So make this your session. Be involved. Know that I've left lots of time in this to be able to respond to questions, kind of tailor what I'm talking about to your needs. If you're online, please use the chat feature. I believe you can do that by clicking at the very top of the page, the little pull-down menu. It gives you options for how to interact with the webinar, and there's a chat button. You can tap that and type a message. So feel free to type questions as they come to you in the chat bar. If I see them come in the chat, I'll address them as I get there in the presentation. If you're face-to-face there on campus, like I said, wave me down, let me know. We'll figure out the best way to communicate your questions as we go. You may just yell and the microphone picks it up, or we may have to type or something, but we will get your questions answered. Okay, before I dive in, is there anything you guys are just absolutely dying to make sure we talk about today that you don't feel like I've got up here on this slide for the goals of the presentation?
I have one.
Go ahead.
I worry a motivation for a student with autism to go to college and to stick with it.
Okay, so how do we address that motivation of like we want them to go to college, we want them to stick with it? We will definitely talk about that a little bit when we talk about characteristics. What I'll generally say is they're a whole lot more like their peers than they're not. So the same motivations that their peers have to find a girlfriend, find a husband, make friends, get away from home, live on their own for the first time, get a job, all those same things apply to our students with autism. And frankly, so do all the same distractions. In the same way that you have typically developing students drop out for reasons that make you scratch your head, or you still have the students who are here because mom expects them to go to college versus not, we see that same kind of diversity in our students with autism. When I talk a little bit about the specific struggles we see with our students, I'll talk about some of the ways that we see stressors impact them that we need to work on. But most of the answer to that question is their motivations are the same as everybody else's. They typically just struggle to know how to get there, even if they're equally motivated or equally not motivated. That goes both directions. Problem behaviors in the classroom. Yes, I've got a whole series of slides about what types of things do students with autism do in the classroom that we have to manage. So we will absolutely talk about that. And I've got, have I got some stories? Probably too many. Excellent, good. Thank you for speaking up. That gives me some stuff to make sure I come back on as we go. Well, let me start with a question. I need to start with some context. I think it's important before I start asking questions just to tell you about why we do the work that we do. It's changed in our perception of autism and what people with autism are capable of in the last 20 years. And we know today more than we ever have before that folks with autism are more than capable of going to school and graduating from college. Our students on the spectrum here at Tech carry an average GPA of 3.0. Their retention rate's about the same as every other student here on campus. We know they can get their degrees, and we know that they're capable of working in real jobs and getting jobs that lead to careers. It's not just that people with autism are going to be content to work at McDonald's or be a janitor anymore. We've got students here who are working on their third and fourth degrees. So what's possible in autism is more than just accommodating them or giving them an experience on a college campus. They can come to college, they can graduate, they can get a real job. They're capable of making friends and getting married. They can have kids, they can be amazing parents, they can be partners. The life probabilities of people with autism, the same as everybody else. They can do anything that anybody else can do. They may just have to learn to do it a little differently. So people with autism, people on the spectrum, they don't have a comorbid intellectual disability. People with autism have the same IQ as everybody. They're just as capable. They just have some additional struggles that makes it likely that they're going to need some either specific supports or they're going to have to learn to manage themselves in a way that gives them what they need. Now, this ought to be fun on a webinar, but I still want to ask, many of you already know you've had students with autism in your classes, or that you've encountered students with autism in your work on campus? Good. My chat folks, yeah, got some yeses there. Very good. How of you know what the diagnosis of autism means? In other words, you know what it means to have a medical diagnosis on the autism spectrum. At least one person raised their hand. That's more than I normally get when I ask that question to everybody. That's one of the things that's changed the most in my career from 20 years ago to today. If I would have asked that question in a room of 20 or 30 people 20 years ago, if one or two of you had even known someone with autism, I would have been stunned. And nobody knew what it meant to have the diagnosis. I'm very glad to see we've got some folks here with a background that have heard about some of the more technical information about autism. And that's where I want to start, because I I want to make sure that you guys are familiar with what it means. If someone comes to your university and presents paperwork that says, I have a diagnosis of autism, I really think it's valuable to understand exactly what that means in terms of how they were diagnosed and what the characteristics of their behavior are. So the first characteristic of autism, what is considered to be the defining characteristic of an autism spectrum disorder, is a persistent deficit in social communication and interaction skills across their life. We used to say that people with autism had language or communication deficits. It's not about their inability to speak. In fact, we know that the majority of folks with autism will learn to talk, they will learn to read, they'll have language skills. The deficits are in their ability to use those language to effectively communicate with other people. So it is the defining characteristic of autism that they struggle in social communication and social interaction, and that struggle is something that is persistent across their life. It's not just with one person or only with adults or only with women. It's everywhere. It means, or this takes several forms. The first is what we call a deficit in social emotional reciprocity. That's a fancy way of saying people with autism can struggle to understand that other people have different feelings or to be able to put themselves in the place of another person. It doesn't mean they don't care how another person feels. It means it's hard for them to think about how their behavior might impact somebody else. In very young children with autism, what this often looks like is if I'm playing with my favorite ball and Susie next to me spills her milk and starts crying, if my teacher said, how do you think Susie feels? The child with autism would say, she's happy, because the child with autism is happy. And so they think everybody feels the way they feel. With our older population of young adults, it's often reflected as if they don't see a problem with what they did, they don't understand why somebody else could see a problem with something they did. So it's often about struggling to realize, wait a minute, that's right, somebody else might interpret what I just did differently. Or if I tell somebody, if they say, oh, what do you think of my haircut? Oh, I don't like it, it's too short. Your face looked better when it was longer and framed by the hair. They don't understand that that might not make the other person super thrilled. About this deficit in the ability to communicate is that there are deficits in nonverbal communication used for interaction. This is one of the things that you are most likely to be noticing when you're interacting with someone on the spectrum. They don't make eye contact well. They don't pick up on facial expression or body language. And so when we talk about, as someone said, problem behavior in the classroom, a lot of times our students with autism are difficult to manage because a lot of the initial things we've learned to do to manage students don't work. So if they don't pick up on nonverbal communication, when you're up front giving a lecture and you give them the look, and we all know the look, or you cross your arms, or you start to walk over beside them, by the time you get to that student, you're upset because you've looked and you've crossed your arms and you've walked over there and you're standing next to them. Hey, and you're still not listening to me, young man. And the student with autism doesn't even realize you're talking to him yet. Recognized all those things you just did as communication. You consistently see that folks with autism miss these nonverbal cues. You'll also see this when they're interacting with their peers. They may crack an off-color joke or try to talk to somebody whose body language is clearly saying, I don't want to be talking to you right now. And they're not picking up on that nonverbal signal, the crossed arms or turning away or closing off the conversational circle. So we see these deficits in the nonverbal aspect of communication. And if you imagine that you have trouble taking somebody else's perspective and you're not good at picking up nonverbal communication, which is over half of our communication, it's not surprising that that makes it hard to build relationships or to maintain relationships that you have. Because relationships are built on reciprocity. They're built on give and take and back and forth and doing things for each other. And when you're not very good at recognizing these things, it can be hard to do it. I want to be very clear here, though. People with autism are just as motivated and just as concerned with having connections with other people as everybody else. I've worked with over 1,000 people with autism in my career. I have never once worked with a client who didn't want friends or who didn't want social connections, who didn't want to build relationships with other people. It's just harder for them to do it. They have to work at it more because of how challenging communication is for them. But just because the communication skills are challenging doesn't mean they don't want to be social. It's one of the myths that I hear about autism. Is actually one of the things I think the Sheldon Cooper character gets wrong in Big Bang Theory, even though he's based on someone with autism. He's pretty well antisocial. He doesn't see the need for other people and doesn't really much care to interact with them. He has to be forced to see the value in a relationship. That's not really my experience of our students. They are incredibly motivated and desiring to have relationships. They just really struggle to build that rapport. So, Jordan, you asked if individuals on the spectrum are aware that they have these deficits. Sometimes yes, sometimes no. I would say most of the time they're aware they're different. With our college students, these tend to be the students who have been the most integrated and frankly the ones who have failed the most. The sad reality is our highest functioning students on the spectrum, the ones who go to college and go into careers, actually fail more often and suffer more for their social deficits than the students who don't, because they're in a social environment much more often, and since they're trying, it tends to be more high stakes. A clearly nonverbal individual on the spectrum who lives with mom, who's in the community with a visible caregiver, who does something that's socially awkward, is typically forgiven pretty easily. Is typically appearing sophomore in college who hits on a girl, doesn't pick up on the social cues that she's not interested, and continues to persist in asking her out, gets a restraining order. Very often our students on the spectrum are aware they're different. They're not always good at noticing in the moment that that's why they're having trouble. So they'll know I'm not really very good at conversations, or I don't pick up body language. But that doesn't mean in the moment when they're not picking up on body language that they realize that's what's happening. That makes sense? Thanks for nodding, by the way, in the live audience. That helps me. Webinars are tough when I ask clarifying questions, so good. Thank you for that. So in addition to this defining characteristic, this social impairment, the next aspect of autism, the next criteria to receive a diagnosis, is the presence of restricted, repetitive, and stereotype patterns of behavior, interests, and activities. And I'm sorry for that large mouthful, but what that big sentence means is that folks on the autism spectrum are very rigid. Things done the same way every time, same time of day, same people, same order. Folks with autism are very regimented people. What you're going to see with folks with autism is that they are going to be your students who, if they've got a seat that they sit in every day and they walk in and somebody's moved that chair or there's somebody sitting in it, they might not handle that well. That might really disrupt them to an extent beyond other students. Although any of you have been in the classroom for any length of time, just know how powerful it is when you mess up the seating chart or they rearrange the room without warning. But this is taken to a greater degree in folks on the spectrum. It manifests in a few different ways. So the first is what we call stereotypy, or repetitive motor movements. And what this means is folks with autism tend to do kind of big motor behaviors. In kids, one of the kind of hallmark behaviors is hand flapping, but folks with autism might rock or they pace. A lot of times folks with autism kind of walk with unusual rigidity, and that's hard to show on a webcam, but they just carry themselves with a little bit more tension than other folks do. They tend to be very repetitive with their behaviors. They might tap their feet a lot, or they might have little rituals that they do. They might twist paper, they might flip pens. It's very different for every kid, but a lot of folks with autism will have very visible or pronounced repetitive motor behaviors. We all do that. We all click pens, we all tap our feet, we all engage in kind of repetitive motor behavior. It's kind of a soothing response that all people have. To get a diagnosis on the spectrum, we want to see that that is more pervasive or is occurring in a way that interferes with their ability to be successful. So you can't see my hands because I'm on a webcam, but I used to be a jazz musician. I was a trumpet player, and my nervous tick, especially when I'm teaching, is to play scales. So I'm constantly engaging in this repetitive behavior, but I've learned to do it in a way that's not interfering. Autism, because they don't easily pick up on kind of that social response and environment, might do repetitive behaviors in ways that are distracting to others or keep them from being able to focus. So they may play the trumpet in front of their face because they're thinking about their scales in class and not be picking up on everyone around them going, that's weird. Because to them, it's just something they do. Another thing about a diagnosis on the spectrum is they have what we call an insistence on sameness, which means they are very fixed in their routines. They tend to want to have the same meal at the same time every day, or they do their homework in the same order. They sit in the same seat. Folks with autism are the ones that if you say a quiz is going to start at 3 o'clock, if it's 3:01 and the quiz isn't on the desk, they're really anxious and bothered by that because we're not following the schedule that was said. So you will encounter this with your students with autism because they tend to want to do things the same way every time. Or they get really insistent on knowing what's the routine, what are the rules, what do I do, what's the schedule, I have to know what's coming. You see a lot of anxiety in autism around this predictability and this need to know what's going to happen next, how long is it going to last, what am I going to do. We also see in autism that they tend to have highly restricted or very fixated interests. So interests that are abnormal in intensity or very focused in terms of what they're after. So folks with autism tend to have one or two things that at that point is what they're absolutely fixated on. And I'm getting some feedback, by the way. Can we all double check, please, to make sure that our mics are muted if that's possible? I'm hearing people, keyboards clicking and office sounds, so that makes me think I've got somebody with an open mic. So if we can just check that, I'd appreciate it. Thank you. So highly restricted fixated interests can mean that someone with autism only wants to talk about Harry Potter because that's what they care about. And if I'm going to make friends, my friends have to know Harry Potter as well as I do. So I'm going to ask everyone that I meet how well they know Harry Potter to decide if they're going to be a good friend for me, because if I can't talk about Harry Potter, that's not going to be someone I want to talk to. To have these really narrow and fixated interests that are noticeable in their intensity or focus. We all have things we're interested in, but their interests tend to be something it's hard to get them away from. You might experience this in class as you're lecturing on social inequality and you mentioned a certain incident that happened in 1850s New York, and they're absolutely fascinated with the military draft, and they spend 10 minutes of your class period telling people about how the 1850 military draft was different than the 1863 military draft, and there were riots in 1863, yada, yada, yada. And so once you've kind of kicked them onto one of those interests, we normally experience it as like They're not going to pick up on, for example, that everyone's got their arms crossed and they're rolling their eyes because they missed the social cues, but they've got this interest that just kind of overrides a lot of things. Now, that said, this is one of those characteristics that I think plays really well for our students in a college environment. I actually joke that for those of us who are professors, we all kind of tick this box because we got our doctorates by reading thousands of articles about really narrow subjects that we could really only share our interest with about 10 other people on the planet. Have narrow, highly restricted, fixed interests. It's about does having that characteristic either interfere or keep them from being able to do other things successful. And then finally, the characteristic that is the hardest to predict, but the one that you might have to be the most sensitive to, is that folks on the spectrum tend to have unusual sensory responses. And what I mean by that is people with autism often have things that bother them or that kind of grab their attention that are unusual. I've had folks with autism who can't wear wool because the texture just bothered them. Or they can't be in a room where a fan is running because the sound is so distracting that they can't concentrate when that sound's going on. We get a lot of folks with autism who, for example, can't stand the sound of fluorescent lights and who might get uncomfortable or not be able to concentrate because there's the flicker of fluorescent lights or that humming sound of the fluorescent lights. Most of our students with autism have something like that is just either an oversensitivity to something like the sounds of the light or of a fan, or maybe they don't react to things that other people would. So you might see that someone with autism doesn't appear to even notice that they're sweating heavily. And other people would notice they're sweating and dab their brow, and someone with autism may just sweat through their clothes and not even appear to be bothered by that. So that would be an undersensitivity to something that would bother most of us. What makes this characteristic hard is that it's different for every person on the spectrum. So everybody with autism doesn't have the same sensory sensitivity. We can't just say, set up your room with calming colors, light blues and greens, and avoid loud, sudden noises. Students with autism here at Tech who have been trumpet players and drummers in the band, they've got no trouble with loud noises and sudden, loud, bright colored environments. But some of our other students can only study if the lights are off and they've got headphones on and they've got a little reading light right over their book to kind of simplify their environment. These characteristics are it. These are the behavioral characteristics of someone who's received a diagnosis on the autism spectrum. Nothing less. This is a diagnosis that's based entirely on behavioral observation. So there is no blood test or genetic scan or X-ray that can show autism. You can't do a genetic screening or do a DNA test. There's nothing in the blood. There's no brain scan or brain region that we say, oh, there it is, take a picture, that's autism. We diagnose autism based on the presence of these two types of characteristic behaviors. It has these behaviors to a degree to which that it interferes with their ability to function, then they qualify to receive a diagnosis on the spectrum. Those symptoms do have to be present early in development. Clear, autism is something you're born with. With autism, you die with autism. It's a neurodevelopmental disability that impacts the way that your brain processes information. So in order to receive a diagnosis of autism, there has to be evidence that these behavioral characteristics were present very early in the child's development. In fact, our most cutting-edge diagnostic work right now is showing that we can see behavioral characteristics of autism in infants as young as 2 to 4 weeks old. We can reliably diagnose autism by 2 years old. These are symptoms that have to be present early in life, and they have to cause impairment. So in other words, the characteristics of autism are things that all of us do to some degree or another. Been socially clueless or missed picking up on nonverbal cues, especially when we were younger. We've all done a poor job of taking perspective of somebody else. We all have repetitive behaviors. And so, Jordan, you asked, do all ASD individuals have all of these symptoms? They have all of the characteristics. How those symptoms manifest is different across every individual, and I'm going to talk about that in just a second. So not all people with autism will act in the same way, but they will manifest all of these characteristics in one form or another. Go back real quick. And I say that everybody with autism has these characteristics. It means that they're going to show all of these deficits or these patterns. What that looks like for a specific individual with autism is different for each individual. Someone with autism with an IQ of 148 may be highly literate, highly verbal, in graduate school, working on a PhD, successfully doing science, and just is completely face blind and does not pick up on the social interactions with lab mates. They may have really good professional relationship skills because those have rules and checklists, but not have any close friends in their research teams. For somebody with autism with an IQ of 70, you might see that they make no attempt to talk to other people, that they just kind of go through the world without appearing to notice anybody else, and they will interact with parents and caregivers, but typically do so with, pointing and pictures and not having kind of deep conversations. So you can show these deficits in different ways, and that's one of the reasons we call it a spectrum disorder. So we call it autism spectrum disorder because for each one of these characteristics, each individual will manifest those characteristics in a different way. Everyone will have them. Everyone will have all of these characteristics, but what they look like will vary from student to student. It's one of the things that makes my job so fun, and one of the things that makes designing accommodations for students with autism so challenging in a college environment, because I can't give you one thing to do that'll work for every student with autism. There will be things that I can give you to do, and I'm going to share some of those today, that will generally work well for most students with autism, but it's not going to be something that's going to work perfectly for all of them. Very good question. The thing we have to do to diagnose autism is we have to make sure that we can't explain these symptoms with another condition. So, for example, individuals with traumatic brain injury can often show some of the same behavioral characteristics of autism, becoming inflexible and rigid, not handling surprises well, kind of losing the ability to either take perspective or communicate with others, especially when they're upset. But if it's a result of an injury, it would not meet qualification to have a diagnosis on the autism spectrum. You could have people who have social anxiety or discomfort with interactions and communication have the behavioral rigidity. Have people with OCD who have the behavioral rigidity, but are otherwise perfectly skilled interacting with other people. So we have to make sure that if we see these characteristics, there's not some other condition that would explain why they're there. According to 3 levels of support needs. So level 3 are the people who are going to be in care the rest of their lives. They may need a 24/7 caregiver. They live in a group home. They require a lot of support, and they don't spend a lot of time out in the community on their own. Folks at level 2 require substantial support but spend most of their day in the community. These are the people who might live in an apartment but have a caregiver that checks in on them a few times a day. They might live at home and they work 10 hours a week, but they don't function independently without someone there to care for them. The level 1 diagnosis is they need help, but they're generally out in the community on their own, navigating with appropriate supports. If you're dealing with somebody in a college setting, if they're at university or they're at a community college, they're a level 1 diagnosis. They're going to be at a level 1 because they're in college. They're having to be independent enough that they're in a dorm or they're able to navigate the community and go to classes and things. So you don't need to know a ton about the different levels beyond knowing that you're going to be encountering most often individuals who are at the higher level of functioning. That's not the way we like to say it anymore, but it's the most clear. Like the folks with autism you're going to encounter are going to have a lot of really good adaptive skills because they've gotten through high school and gotten into college. You're going to have a lot of skills to work with, even if you're going to have some pretty persistent deficits, especially in the communication area. To your advantage when we talk about ways we can help support those students once they're with us. A few other just facts about autism, because I like to take the opportunity to educate a little when I do these presentations. Autism has more boys than girls. It's about 4 to 5 to 1 right now. So for every 1 girl with autism, there'll be 4 or 5 boys. We suspect that's likely because there is a genetic component to autism, and it's not unusual to see gender differences when you have genetic disorders. If you have a sibling with autism, you are 8 times more likely to have autism yourself. If you have a family member with autism, you're 4 times more likely to have autism. So we know that autism runs in families, and we know that the behavioral characteristics run in families. So we often see that maybe the son has a diagnosis of autism and the dad doesn't have a diagnosis, but he's just a little bit rigid. He's a very fixed guy. He follows the same schedule every day. Maybe he's a little socially awkward, but he's married, he's got a kid, he's got a job, he's generally okay, but he's not at a diagnostic level. But we see those characteristics kind of pass through families. So we know there's a genetic component to autism as a condition. Know what the cause of autism is. We don't know what the specific triggering event is. We don't know where to look in the genes or in the brain. Every single area of the brain that's been associated with the deficits of autism is also associated with other conditions and other diagnoses as well. So there is no clear cause, and there's no clear area of the brain or the body that shows, hey, autism's here, besides the way the behavior appears. Allow me my soapbox for just a moment, but I can say unequivocally that vaccines do not cause autism. There's over 50 years of research showing no link between vaccines and autism. The prevalence rates of autism are the same in countries that do and do not vaccinate. Prevalence rates of autism are the same in places that do different schedules of vaccination. Rates of autism are the same across countries that have different ingredients in their vaccines. The prevalence rates of autism do not in any way vary according to the presence, absence, schedule, or ingredients in vaccines. The one study that showed a connection between vaccines and autism was a faked study done by a doctor who was a stakeholder in a rival company to a vaccine that he was trying to put that company out of business so his company could sell a vaccine. He got run out of the country, he lost his medical license, and the study got retracted, but the news doesn't report that the way they do the initial connection. So vaccines don't cause autism. I'll get off my soapbox now. We don't know what does, but we also know that there's no cure for autism. That's not necessarily a bad thing. It just means that because it's a neurological condition, because it's a way that your brain functions, we're not trying to cure autism. What we're trying to do is effectively support people with autism to manage their symptoms. I like to use the analogy of diabetes. Once you have diabetes, you have it. You're going to have diabetes for the rest of your life. But with appropriate environmental and behavioral management and support, people with diabetes are virtually indistinguishable from everybody else, and they can live a full and complete life with diabetes. Autism the same way. With appropriate support and learning how to function and getting some help that they need to overcome some of the challenges with their conditions, folks with autism can live in the community and do everything anybody else can do. The prevalence of autism is increasing. So the most recent estimates are 1 in 59 8-year-olds are being diagnosed with an autism spectrum disorder. That is 150% higher than the prevalence rates when I started 20 years ago. That increase is due, we think, to a number of factors. The first is we're just more aware of autism than we ever used to be. We look for it more often. We're aware that it's a thing. Pediatricians and doctors are looking for autism in early childhood screening today. Schools are doing much more work to identify it. And the more we are aware of it, the more we realize autism's always been around at a rate a lot higher than we thought. A change in diagnostic criteria in 2013. So in 2013, the diagnostic criteria for autism changed to be more inclusive of the population that the research was showing us had autism. Before 2013, it was commonly thought that up to 50% of people with autism also had an intellectual disability. So that the IQ range in autism is exactly the same as the rest of the population. And so we changed the diagnostic criteria to reflect what we've learned about how autism presents across IQ levels and across class and racial divides. For reasons we don't fully understand, we also know that there are just more people with autism today than there ever have been. That's the smallest part of the increase in prevalence, but it's still a very real reason, and we're really not sure why. Now, why should you care? I'm kind of preaching to the choir here because you're here, but I just want you to know why this matters. 20 years ago, almost 80% of people with autism would live in an institution or a group home after high school. So when I started my career, if a student came into my classroom with a diagnosis of autism, we pretty much figured they were going to need 24/7 care for the rest of their lives. Over half of people with an autism diagnosis are going to attend some kind of post-secondary education after high school. We've come a long way in knowing how to educate and support folks with autism in the last 20 years, to the point that now students with autism are one of, and depending on which metric you look at, the fastest growing proportion of new students attending college in the world. There are more students with autism in college today than there ever have been, and their proportion is growing. Someone made a comment about just how many of their students were coming in with autism now and how surprising it is. It is, but then it's not. So I follow TEA, and they put out annual reports all the time about the numbers of students served. And last year in Texas public schools, there were almost 72,000 students with autism in K-12 education in the state of Texas. It means that in the next 10 years, 70,000 students with autism just in the state of Texas will be graduating from high school, and we expect that at least half of those 70,000 students are going to attend college. Mind-blowing to me. It's exciting, but it's also like, oh my God, because we only know of a handful of programs in the state that are designed to support college students with autism. And one of the reasons I love to do trainings like this is I'm trying to recruit you guys to be one of them, or at least to start to learn, if not a formal program, to get folks comfortable knowing that students with autism are going to be on your campus, because they're coming. It's happening. You're already telling me they're there, and there will be more. That's autism. That's what it is. That's a little bit about it. about next is how those characteristics manifest in the classroom and some things you can do to help them. But I just want to pause and ask, do I have any questions about anything I've said so far? Anything you want to know about? Any questions about what autism is or anything that I've said so far?
You said the 71,951 students with autism, that's like in Texas all in all, or is that in the nation?
Is K-12 education in the state of Texas. So that number was just published by TEA about 2 months ago. It was every student with an autism eligibility in the state of Texas in 2018, 2019.
I have a question. So where are the, I guess with these statistics, how is the diagnosis happening? Is it school counselors? Is it self-reporting?
So in the state of Texas, the overwhelming majority of autism identifications are coming through the schools. The average age of first diagnosis in Texas right now is about 6. And they tend to be coming in more from school identifications than private medical diagnosis. Out here in West Texas, we only have 2 psychologists that diagnose autism formally. And so the absolute majority of our students out here are coming in with a special ed identification, not like a formal medical test or diagnosis.
And so how does that affect access to, like, I guess just without a formal diagnosis, does that affect access to maybe some of the programs or anything like that?
I love that you asked that question. I can spend an hour on that alone with how many transition programs we work. It actually has a significant negative impact on access to a lot of supports. One of the things we try really hard to educate our parents and our individuals about is that a school identification and eligibility for special education is not the same thing as a medical diagnosis, period, whether it's autism or anything else. And once you graduate high school, the overwhelming majority of all adult services require a medical diagnosis. And so what we see happen a lot here in Texas is a student graduates high school and they go to college and go to their student disability services office and says, I need accommodations. Here's my IEP. Student disability services says, where's your diagnosis? I said, here's my IEP. That's not the same thing. And then they're stuck. And they have to go get a psychological or pay for somebody to do a diagnosis to be able to qualify for services. We see the same thing with state vocational rehabilitation services, state residential waivers. All of the adult services in the state of Texas require a medical diagnosis, and we call it the cliff. Kids graduate high school, go straight off the cliff, and it might take 9 or 12 months just to go get the assessments and the diagnoses to go apply for adult services if they didn't already get that medical diagnosis when the kids were still in school. It's actually one of the biggest barriers to adult services in the state of Texas for folks with autism. And it can be kind of hard to address because we're already in a post-secondary setting. By the time they get to us, it's already happened. So we need to do a better job. And by we, I mean a center like mine, not you, of helping our families understand the difference between those two things and why it matters to getting into something like a post-secondary program. I have a typed question for chat asking if Asperger's is the same as level 1. The short and easy answer is yeah, that's probably a good way to think about it. Technically, we don't diagnose Asperger's anymore. So when I said we changed the diagnostic criteria in 2013, from 2013 on, what used to be called Asperger's is simply the top part of the autism spectrum. We don't discriminate between the two. We say everyone that has these characteristics is on the spectrum, and one class of people on the spectrum are the people who would have been called people with Asperger's. And level 1's a pretty good alignment. I could get really technical about why it's not perfect, but yeah, basically our folks, what I'll say is a lot of your college students on the spectrum who today would be given a level 1 diagnosis 20 years ago or 18 years ago when they were diagnosed were probably going to get an Asperger's diagnosis. You'll often also see a lot of students with autism in the college setting who actually have an ADHD diagnosis, who then maybe when they got a little older went to a counselor or a psychologist who said, actually, I think it might be autism, you know, because maybe they were really hyperactive kids and the motor behavior and they couldn't focus. And but it was missed that the social component wasn't there until they got further along in school and life. Very good question on the chat as well. Questions about that?
Actually, I do have a question. I'm studying special education in college right now, and I know there's certain standards and things that the state requires of you, and boundaries you cannot like cross when it comes to informing your parents. And in regards to like services, and like kind of like you want to tell them what to do, but then there's also like that line of like you can't really tell them what to do. Like, what would you suggest as like a future teacher to help your students transition into college?
I think that's an outstanding question. What we try to do very much, I shouldn't say very hard, what we try to do is make sure we tell parents where they can seek that information. I may not be able to hand them a brochure and say, here's the counselor's name, call and demand this exact service. But I can say, have you ever heard of the Partners Resource Network? They're an amazing parent group in the state of Texas that gives free consultation about transition services and your legal rights in special education. And if you call them, they'll do a free record review with you, and they can talk to you about your student's file or how to access state services. And then I maintain really friendly relationships with all the parent groups in town and make sure they know, share with me when you're doing parent training, share with me when you're doing advocacy events, and I'll make sure all of our clients know about it. So that, yeah, there's things I may not be able to say directly, but if I know who can say them, I try to make sure my families get hooked up with the people who can do that work. Okay, so Jordan, what other kind of conditions are often misdiagnosed besides ADHD? We used to see generalized anxiety disorder before they realized childhood schizophrenia wasn't really a thing. 15 years ago or so, we used to see a lot of kids with a childhood schizophrenia diagnosis. Nowadays, I would say the most common thing we see is ADHD. In girls, very specifically with girls with autism, we see a lot of misdiagnosis as some sort of social personality disorder. And so Dawn says there have been several students who are upset about the change away from Asperger's. Oh yeah, they have. It's probably one of the most contentious decisions ever made in autism in the last 10 years. What I try to tell people is we don't say Asperger's isn't a thing. It doesn't mean in 2013 that Asperger's isn't real. What the 2013 diagnosis change did is recognize that Asperger's is part of the same autism spectrum as PDD-NOS and autism and the other conditions. It's all on the same continuum. It doesn't mean that if you have a diagnosis of Asperger's that you don't have Asperger's anymore. So I have to be kind of careful as someone who works in more of the assessment side, but it didn't actually do away with Asperger's as a description of a very specific set of characteristics on the autism spectrum. It just means we don't diagnose someone with Asperger's anymore. We're going to diagnose them on the autism spectrum. And then if they happen to recognize they meet the behavioral characteristics of someone with Asperger's, it's not technically wrong to call themselves that. It's just not a diagnostic label we're going to give anymore. But yeah, we have had a lot of high-functioning adults who don't think the word Asperger's has the same stigma that autism does, and they don't much care to be called someone with autism versus Asperger's. That's a very, very real thing we have run into. All right. Excellent question so far, folks. I want to keep going and just make sure we get into some of the tips and characteristics, but keep asking those kinds of questions. That's exactly what this presentation is for. What I want to talk about now are some of the characteristic behaviors that are going to cause you problems and some of the things you can do about it. And we're going to talk about 4 characteristic behaviors that, in my experience with our college students particularly, cause the most trouble for our students and for the staff that interact with them. Those is being literal. If I had to pick the one thing that people with autism do that just absolutely drives staff and professors bonkers, it is their tendency to be literal. Because people with autism don't pick up on body language and they don't pick up on kind of the nonverbal aspects of language, they tend to interpret what you say by exactly what you said, just the words. And they're not doing it to be difficult. They're not doing it to be smart Alex, but it sure feels that way. So if you say, do something with that lady in the background, well, that response is exactly what you said to do. I'll take you off. This picture actually represents my favorite autism picture of probably the last 5 years. It was posted by a mom on Facebook, so that's her child with autism out there looking through the window. And his fascination, his fixation was video games. And she just was so frustrated because he would never get off the computer and go play outside like the other kids. And so one day she got frustrated and just said, "Will you go play outside?" That's what he did. He took his table and his chair and his computer and he parked it under a tree and he played his games outside. That is autism. I promise you, if you have interacted with someone on the spectrum, you have encountered this literalness. You may not have recognized it as them being overly literal, but it happens. It's the thing that I see is the reason I get a call or a referral a lot of the time is someone with autism was literal and the person they were working with thought that they were being disrespectful or defiant rather than interpreting the language just the way that you said it. What's to happen with instructors is that when you're working with someone with autism, you have to be very aware of your language. You have to be prepared to explain exactly what you want and realize that you are likely to have to clarify. That someone with autism is going to do exactly what you tell them to do. My favorite college stories for this is a student who came to us and he was so excited to be in college. This was a bright kid. He'd been in the honors program in high school. He was at Tech. He had always wanted to be at a four-year school. And he was in his first classes. And it came to the first series of tests and he bombed his first quiz. And when his tutor was talking to him about it, it was like, but we've been together studying. Like, I've seen you practice this. You took great lecture notes. Here's your notes. We practiced. What happened? And the guy's like, I don't know. I did everything they told me to do. I mean, everything you told me to do to get ready for the exam, I did it. And the tutor looks down and realizes that the textbook for that class is in the student's backpack, still in the cellophane. The tutor's like, wait a minute. That's your textbook. Uh-huh. Why haven't you read it? Well, no one told me I had to. Syllabus. The student goes, no, it's not. Look, I looked, and they pulled out their syllabus, and they've written all over their syllabus and noted. And on the syllabus calendar, it simply said Unit 1, Chapters 1 through 5. And say, read Chapters 1 through 5. When the professor or the tutor in their interactions with the student had said, read the book. They had just assumed it was obvious when they said, Unit 1 covers Chapters 1 through 4, that meant read Chapters 1 through 4. Fix. The tutor went in on the syllabus and wrote the word read next to all of the unit chapter listings. That was a really good student who was really motivated, who was so literal that because the syllabus didn't say read the chapter, he didn't think he was supposed to read the chapter. This is a characteristic that manifests itself in a lot of ways. And what I want to encourage you is when you're talking to your students on the spectrum, when they go left and you thought they should have gone right, or when they say something that you go, where did that come from? I want you to pause. And I want you to ask yourself, what did I just say? And you're going to realize that 9 times out of 10, that person with autism has done exactly what you said, just not what you meant, hoped, or intended. The humor in autism to me now, like this is the piece that makes me laugh the most once I catch it. And it's okay in the moment to realize this will tick you off initially because you're human. The other place that I see that manifesting is that they're not picking up on those nonverbal cues. Since they don't make eye contact well and they're really not able to interpret facial expression and body language, they're often very unaware and struggle to kind of see what impact am I having on this environment. They really struggle to realize that, like, oh, if I fart in class, if it doesn't bother me, it shouldn't bother anybody else. They won't notice that the student sitting next to them in a lecture hall becomes physically uncomfortable and turns away. Or I had one student who thought, well, I have to show the professor that I've studied, so I need to make sure that I answer every question he asks so he knows that I'm well prepared, and didn't pick up on either the professor or the other students' discomfort with the fact that he was that guy in a college class who was answering every single question and not giving anybody else a chance to jump in. He thought he was being a good student because he had heard the rule, oh, you have to be prepared and be ready to answer questions, as then I have to answer the questions every time. And he wasn't aware of what was happening around him in terms of he didn't realize how frustrating that was for other students. So it can look a lot of different ways. Sometimes this means they talk too much. Just talked about as an example of that. He didn't realize that in a lecture class, the professor needed to talk the most. He thought talking was the way he showed that he had learned. But it can also manifest as talking too literal. Because a lot of our college students are aware that they struggle with this, if they pick up on the fact that they're not being successful, or they get nervous that people are uncomfortable or don't like them, sometimes what you see is they get really withdrawn and they won't participate at all because they would rather not participate than participate and miss something and make a mistake and people not like them, or they get in trouble. So sometimes you see that it shuts them down, that they become really anxious to participate because they're worried where they have poor social perception, and it makes them very leery of trying. So sometimes you see they're the bulls in the china shop that just go full tilt boogie because they don't realize they're dominating in conversation. Other times it's really hard to draw them out of their shell because they're so nervous about making a mistake that they stop trying. Folks with autism struggle as well with knowing how to modulate their voices. Some folks with autism will talk in a very flat way, and it just might be unusual pacing or very flat. Other folks with autism talk really loud all the time because they're excited and they don't know how to tell the difference. We learn to modulate our voices based on the way the audience is responding to our tone and our volume. If you don't pick up on nonverbal cues well, it can be hard to know if I'm being too loud or if I'm being too quiet, because most of us show people that by a frown or putting a finger to our ears or turning away or covering our ears, and they may not pick up on that. I get a lot of referrals from professors is that they don't pick up on the signals. A professor who's been managing lecture halls or group discussions for 10 or 15 years is the professor that has a whole lot of tricks to manage behavior without stopping their lecture and interrupting class. But all of those tricks are nonverbal. It's not just the look and the crossed arms and the walking around in proximity. It's also how you move through the space or divide students. It's how you point. It's the pointed look or the look away. There's all kinds of nonverbal ways that, especially in college environments, we as instructors and professors or staff members in offices learn to help kind of manage our environment. And people with autism are right in the middle of that room responding to none of it. They're not picking up on any of the signals that a professor thinks, well, anyone in college should know by now that if a professor stops talking and looks at them, it means I want you to stop what you're doing. Folks with autism don't know that. They even recognize that the professor has stopped talking and is looking at them. They may realize that there's no more words. I've had students with autism actually, when something like that happened, look up and go, well, aren't you going to keep talking? Without realizing that that silence was about them. So a lot of times professors get frustrated because they're trying to manage a person with autism's behavior non-verbally, and that's not going to work. You're going to have to learn to work verbally. What you often see as well is that the students get frustrated because they did what the professor said and it didn't work. So I had a student with autism in a composition class a couple of years ago, and his learning specialist came in laughing one day. He said, okay, I've got a story for your trainings. And I went, hit me up. I love new stories. And this student was really upset. He wanted to go to the department chair about how bad this professor was. Okay, why does he want to go to the department chair? And he said, well, he keeps getting a bad grade on a paper, and he's convinced he's doing exactly what the professor said to do, and that the professor is being unreasonable because he's not seeing that he met his standards. I said, okay, so what's happening? And he goes, he keeps losing credit for formatting on this English paper. The professor keeps telling him he's not formatting the paper correctly, and he's resubmitted it twice, and he keeps losing the same credit, and he's really mad because he knows he's done what the professor said. I said, okay. And he hands me the kid's paper. He goes, tell me what you think happened. And when I'm looking at the paper, it's bothering me. Something is just wrong. I realize and start laughing, and so does my learning specialist. The professor had said, be sure to double space your paper. And the student with autism thought double spacing meant to put 2 spaces everywhere you were usually going to put 1. So there were 2 spaces between every word and 4 spaces between every sentence, but it was a single-spaced paragraph. And the student was beside themselves because the student was like, I have double-spaced everything with a space. I went and counted. There is not a single 1-space gap in this paper. It is double-spaced. What does this professor not understand? Have a conversation about what double spacing was relative from the literal meaning to what we mean in formatting. So this student had a lot of frustration because they thought they were following directions, but it wasn't working. Before, when I talked about the characteristics, that one of the things that our students struggle with in college is sensory sensitivities. And a lot of that is because there is a lot of variability in the college environment. Different classrooms have different temperature levels, lighting levels, types of seating, levels of noise. And so most of our students are going to have at least one of those environments that's really, really hard for them to manage. This is not something that'll have a universal answer, but when I tell people I'm training about autism, what I say is, please respect that. Understand that if a student comes to you and says, hey, this really bothers me, it's not a choice. It's not something that they can just say, oh, I'm going to choose to tolerate it for the next hour. If they have a sensory sensitivity that's a part of their disability, it's part of their diagnosis of autism, it's not as simple as just choosing to not let it bother them. This isn't a sensory sensitivity that's within their control. So we can help them learn to manage it, but it's not going to be possible just to tell them, well, that's the way this classroom works, deal with it. If they could deal with it, they already would be. Grandin's a famous college professor on the spectrum, and her particular sensitivity is sound. And what she describes it as is she's fine until she's not. And then when some loud or particularly sharp noise happens, that's all she can hear. That she's not capable of just ignoring it. Once that noise is bothering her, It was like a drill going into her ears, and there was no focusing through it. She had to either leave to get away from it, or it needed to stop. But once that sensory response kicked in, that was it. If you have a student in your class or a student in your office and they get overwhelmed by the sensory environment, it's important that you not try to force them to deal with it. Either they're going to need to leave, or you're going to need to change that environment to take away what's overwhelming them. It's not going to be a simple matter of just saying, well, for this semester, that's what it is. There are ways to help them deal with it. There are therapeutic interventions that work, but they have to be done by specialists. That's what places like my behavior clinic are for. It's not something you freelance in the classroom between professor and student or staff and student. So just understand that students with autism may present with unusual sensory sensitivities, but those are real things. In my experience, folks with autism, especially those that have made it all the way to college, do not like the fact that they can't handle some of these things. It usually bothers them, and they're very embarrassed that they have to get up and leave the room if it's too loud, or that they can't concentrate with the light. And so sometimes that means they won't ask for relief. You may need to talk to them and figure out, hey, what's going on? Because maybe you can do something about it. You can let them sit in a different chair or put them on a different side of the room away from the noise that's bothering them. I've had students in large lectures who maybe couldn't stand the smell of somebody's perfume and soap, but because they were so routine driven, they still wanted to sit in the same chair they had always sat in, and they wanted the other person to move. So we had to talk to them about sometimes you have to break a routine if it's going to put you in a better place for your sensory sensitivity. You're going to see with our folks with autism is that motor behavior, that repetitive motor behavior. A lot of our students, even in college, will pace or tap hard surfaces. They might line up their desks perfectly or spin things. They often do this most often when they're stressed, and it can be an indicator that they're feeling a little uncomfortable. What we have to do is help them start to recognize maybe how to do that most effectively in class. But I've had some students with autism who, like, if they were allowed to just walk back and forth at the back of the classroom, that allowed them to concentrate on the lecture. If they had to sit in a desk, maybe there was some sensory reason it was hard for them to focus. A lot of times this repetitive behavior is something they use to deal with their sensory sensitivities. And so we have to recognize that this may, again, be something that they can't just say, sorry, okay, I apologize, I'm not going to pace for the next 2 hours. Or I can just choose not to have to rock or to line things up. It's not as simple as, oh, it's a choice and they just want to do it so they can choose not to do it. This is often something they feel is a compulsion. It also means they're going to have trouble with surprises and changes in routine. So if you're running a class or you're doing a regular group meeting or they're coming in for a regular process, just understand that if you've set up a classroom routine, if they come in on Tuesday and you don't follow the routine, that's going to be really hard for them. I've seen students with autism melt down because it was math class and the teacher came in and said, hey, I know it's math time, but surprise, we're going to do an ice cream party. And the kid with autism is like, but it's math time. We're supposed to do math. If it's math time, I have to do math. If I don't do math, I don't get my grade. And they get stuck on this routine, and I can't have a surprise, even if it's something I really love. If I can tell you nothing more out of this presentation about your students with autism that you can do proactively to support them, it's please be mindful that they don't handle surprises and changes in routine well. Advance warning you can give that there will be some difference in your class or some difference in the way you do something next week or the week after. The more you can warn them in advance, the better your life is and the easier it'll be for them to handle it. Examples of being repetitive and routine driven. A student with autism has a particular routine that they think is what they need to follow. They may miss other obvious symbols, other obvious signals. So for example, I had a young man who had gotten into the dating scene and decided that he'd read a few books on how to date and he knew how to get a date. And unfortunately, he had gotten into the pickup artist community. If you know anything about the pickup artist community, that's a scary group of people. It's essentially a movement that teaches very vulnerable young men how to engage in sexual harassment and sexual assault in order to get sexual gratification. They won't come out and say that. But the pickup artist community is the group that says, insult her until she's angry, buy her enough drinks that she's drunk, and then take advantage of her when she's incapacitated. So he wasn't a vindictive or angry person by nature, but he was someone with autism who was desperately looking for rules on how to do things. And so he got into one of their books and it said, okay, here's how you pick up a girl. You go up and tell her something you like and tell her she's going to go on a date with you. She's going to tell you no. That's okay. When she tells her no, say, that's not good enough. At least have coffee with me. And this book had given him like a routine of this is how you make sure she dates you. Restraining order out of that, because the young woman that he picked wasn't drunk or at a bar or particularly vulnerable, but he kept following that routine, even though she and her behavior was making very clear, you need to stop. I'm not interested. I don't want you to do this. He's like, and he literally looked at me and said, but the book said if I kept doing it, it would work. So he wasn't picking up on the social signals. He was following what he thought was the routine. I'm actually going to skip these because I've told those stories already because I got ahead of myself. So what can you do to help your students with predictability and stability? Well, the first thing you can do is be visual. One thing we know about folks with autism is they tend to be very visual in terms of their communication. I think it has something to do with the communication difficulty with language. They often respond really well to things like calendars and class agendas, things like I did at the first of this talk that showed you the order of events. They do really well when you can give them a way to know what to expect. People go, I don't know what a visual schedule is or how to make one. And I say, yeah, you do. If you've ever made a syllabus or you use your Outlook calendar, those are visual schedules. A visual schedule just means you give them a way to see what you're doing and what's going to happen next. As I said before, make sure you warn them about any sort of differences. If quiz day is going to be different than lecture day, if you're going to have a guest lecture, if you're going to show a movie, give them advance notice that there'll be some kind of change in what you do in your class. Don't be afraid to give them rules to help them do all of this. Give them rules to know what you expect. Tell them how to turn in their papers. Tell them where to go find information. Tell them where to look in the syllabus. Say about most of the accommodations for autism that I've been sharing and I'm about to share is they help everybody. Good teaching is good teaching. Good supports are good supports. If you do this for students with autism, it's also going to help the rest of the students in your class. I try really hard not to give advice that I don't think would work across different settings. Not unusual for folks with autism to navigate the environment with rules rather than by social interaction. And so what we sometimes see is that rather than looking to people to know what to do, they follow rules about how to get through situations. So there's a couple that we've had here in the last few years. We had one young man who had this rule that he always does math problems in order. I don't know where it came from, but that was the rule that he had. And that's all fine and dandy until the day that he didn't know how to answer the first question on one of his algebra quizzes. And he stared at a blank piece of paper for 40 minutes and didn't do any of the questions on the quiz because he didn't know how to answer the first question. I had another student, and I suspect it was a motor and sensory thing. He didn't like the texture of erasing. He was left-handed, but he always said, I don't erase wrong answers, I cross them out. He hated using erasers. Okay, until he got in a large enrollment class and took his first Scantron exam. Didn't go so well for him. it's worth asking sometimes if they do something unusual, why did you do that? A lot of times they'll tell you a rule. They'll tell you why they did it. The good news is for you as a teacher is that if you can teach a positive rule, if you can give them a rule that's going to work for you, they're going to follow it. They are literal and they love routine. They're going to follow rules that you give them. They love rules. So find ways to tell them what to do and state it as a rule. Students who might disrupt class by talking too much, I can say, in this class, you can ask 2 questions during each class disruption. Say, once you've answered a question, you have to wait until at least 3 other students have asked questions before you ask another question. Rule, by the way, that you can apply to the entire class. It's a good rule for facilitating discussion anyway, but it's a way to teach them what do you want to see, stated in a positive, in a way that gives you what you want. Let them know, oh, this is how I ask questions in this class. If you give them that kind of rule, they are highly likely to follow it. Where are you most likely to see this? Well, the most common place college students with autism struggle is with group work and projects. And if you think about the social communication deficits as the key characteristic of autism, group work and projects are going to be the single most difficult thing in most classes for a student with autism to navigate. So see it in the form of that unusual social behavior, that too many questions or not responding, talking in an unusual way, and you're going to see that more often when they're stressed. In fact, it's a marker for us, for our students, on how they're doing, that if we start seeing more of the stereotypy, more of the big motor behaviors, or more of the unusual speech patterns, that tells us they're under stress and we need to figure out what's going on. Also see that they don't typically find rewarding the things that other students do. Folks with autism are not going to be the ones in the cafeteria chatting and running over with their friends. Cafeterias are overwhelming in social environments. We also tend to see that students with autism do not do well in unstructured time with other people. They're the most calm in social environments when there are clear rules and expectations. If I go to a trivia night, there's a specific thing I'm supposed to do and a way to do it, and I might be fine at trivia night. But if I go to a birthday party and everyone's sitting around the living room with a beer, I have no idea what to do. Most students would prefer sitting around in a circle with a beer. Our folks with autism might find that to be one of the scariest situations to be in college. The thing to expect is that folks with autism tend to overreact to our perception to even minor disruptions. So you might see that they're really bothered by a small change that you don't think is that big a deal. It might be that the cutlery is mismatched. You don't think that should matter, but to them it does. Or things aren't spaced correctly. I can always tell when I'm giving a lecture to students with autism, like in our college program, because they're going to be the ones that remind me that, hey, you have 2 periods at the end of that sentence on the slideshow, or hey, that was a different font size on this slide than the last slide. They tend to be very aware of details, and it can sometimes bother them. And we'll also see, in a way that I also encounter as a reason for concern, that once they're overwhelmed, they may shut down or just leave. The reason that can be disconcerting for a professor or a staff member is you may just be trying to help them get enrolled or advise them on what classes they should enroll in, and once they get overwhelmed, I just can't do this right now, and they get up and walk away. When they're in college, they usually do that because they know what they need to do to calm down, but they're too ashamed to do it in front of you. Once they get overwhelmed, you may see that they just shut down or they just flee because they know what they need to do to calm down, but they don't want to do it in front of you. Or they may know, I just have to go pace for 10 minutes to calm down because now that I'm overwhelmed, I have to pace. But I'm not supposed to pace in front of my professors. That's embarrassing. That'll make me look different. And that just locks them up. And what I'm going to say to kind of close this is that talking doesn't help. The biggest mistake we make in trying to help a student with autism in distress in the college environment is we try to talk them down or talk them through being stressed or upset. That's not going to work. The defining characteristic of autism is social communication barriers. And if you think of yourself at a time when you've been angry or overwhelmed or afraid or scared, people talking to you either. Add on to that the pressure of not knowing how to talk very effectively when you're stressed. Talking to them when they're having these reactions is not going to work. What we say is give them space. Respect that they might need to step away. Call a student with autism out who needs to walk out of your room. I say, tell them in advance, if you need a break or you get overwhelmed, it's okay to step out in the hall and do what you need to do. Come back in, you're fine. I'm going to talk a student with autism down. Give them space, allow them to calm themselves down, and let them come back in when they're ready. I have hit my time. I want to respect your time. There are some additional slides at the end of this. Like I said, I had more slides than I could possibly use based on what you guys wanted to know about. I'm going to give you the whole slideshow so that you have some of the other things at the end there. But here at the end, I just want to make sure if there are any last questions or anything you guys want me to spend a few more minutes talking about. I've hit the formal end of this thing, but I'm happy to stay on for a few more minutes and answer questions from anyone who has them.
I have a question. So you talked earlier about how people with autism have a hard time with themselves issues, and how if they don't think they're doing something wrong, then they wouldn't think other people think so. So how does that work in sports? Do people who have autism participate a lot in sports? How does that work in terms of getting feedback from the coach or playing in front of the coach?
So that's a great question. How's it apply to sports? I see a lot of folks with autism who like sports because they're very structured. There are rules and there's a way you play the game and there's a set period of time that you play, and practice tends to be very structured. Where we'll see often stress in that environment is, as you said, feedback from a coach or feedback from peers. If it's not delivered in a structured and predictable way, can be difficult. But I think the most common place I've seen our folks with autism struggle in sports is if an umpire makes a bad call, or a coach tells the team, I'm going to play the best player, and the student with autism has a 427 batting average, and the next player has a 426 batting average, and they think batting average is what should determine who's the best player. So it tends to come down to tolerance for people being human. That holds not just in sports, but where I've seen it be difficult in sports is because sports are so structured. When you get to those human judgments, or you get to those circumstances on the team or with the coach where, but you said the rule was this, that's where I kind of see it be difficult. What we try to do when we work with students in that situation is we're going to work with them to learn how to tolerate someone being wrong. So I might say, you know what? Sometimes people don't do what the rule says they should do. And you have to ask yourself, is this someone that I'm allowed to correct, or is this someone who I'm not allowed to correct? If I'm not allowed to correct them, it's okay to be upset that they didn't follow the rule, but I shouldn't say anything about it. And so we'll work with them therapeutically to give them a rule for how to handle when they get upset by that kind of surprise. We spend a lot of our day in the center working with the students saying, okay, let's give you a rule for that. Let's figure out a routine for what you do when that particular disruption comes. And let's see, I had a question I know about housing and roommates. That is definitely the same thing I would say there. If you're seeing a particular type of conflict or a particular type of struggle with students with autism and their roommates, you might develop a series of expectations or rules that you can use with that resident to say, okay, you know, each roommate is entitled to this or should be able to expect that. Conflict resolution can be kind of hard initially if they haven't had a lot of practice at it, but the beauty of conflict resolution is that you've got some protocols out there that are very rule driven, like everybody has to have a say. Listen for 2 minutes, talk for 2 minutes, write down what you want, write down what they want, negotiate. They'll respond best to a more formal process. So conflict resolution for folks with autism goes best if you put a formal process with rules in place, so that way they know what to expect. Like, okay, when we do this, when we talk to your roommate about how you guys need to work better together, here's what we're going to do. We're going to let each of you talk about what's working and what isn't. We're going to let each of you talk about what you want and what bothers you. We're going to both offer suggestions for what we can do differently, and then we're going to agree on what you're going to do, and we're going to write that down. So if you can identify and follow a more formal conflict resolution process, almost like mediation, it could be a written, here's what the process looks like. That's going to be the most comfortable way for a student with autism to navigate that kind of dialogue. Let's typed in and asked, what are some accommodations that we could consider when working in a group environment with students with autism and group activities? I'm going to say the same thing. Be as specific as possible about what the responsibilities for group members are. You might say, you guys are going to work on a group to complete this 4-step process. There'll be 4 people in the group. Each member of the group is expected to do 1 step in the process. Each group is expected to meet at least twice outside of class and make notes of what was talked about in that meeting. Group members are expected to respond to each other's emails. Think about, in a perfect world, what do you want that group to do? And then articulate it. One of the things that I love the most about working with folks with autism is it's made me a better teacher, because I have to learn to articulate my expectations very precisely. So if I'm going to set up a group project, all of my students will respond better if I make clear, to get full credit, you have to meet twice outside of class and document it with an email. You each do 1 piece of it. This is how you do it. So the better you can kind of scaffold exactly what you want to see happen in that group activity, so that the person with autism can take it step by step and say, okay, I may not like working in groups, but I only have to talk to them for 30 minutes and I have to do my piece. And as long as I do my step, I'm okay. It's still going to be hard for them. But if you can give them a clear agenda and a clear expectation, they tend to be so rule governed that if you give them the rule, they'll follow it. Okay. Yes, sir.
I have my autism, and I'm pretty good with like finding like red flags with like relationship people or friends. But what would you do to like benefit from like, or get better with like making sure not being taken advantage, because that can be a problem sometimes.
Oh yeah, getting taken advantage of happens to everybody. That's the first thing I'm going to say. We have to fail a lot at making friends and building relationships. I like to say, you don't know who you should date until you've dated a few people you shouldn't. You don't know what a good friend is until a few people haven't been very good friends to you. And so some of it is looking back and saying, you know, I didn't like it when that person did that to me. That felt like they took advantage of me. And asking, what did they do that I didn't like? And could I have seen that earlier? Like, was there something they did before that happened that, you know, I noticed that everyone who takes advantage of me always only talks about themselves. Or, you know, find that pattern and free, because what some people think of as being taken advantage of, other people may not. Some people are really happy to share money or feed people all the time, and other people, don't want to do that. So it's what it feels like to you. If you're in a relationship with someone and you don't feel like it's equal and each of you are getting something out of it, then it's okay to say, I don't like this, and not be in that relationship anymore. Fairly long one here saying someone's interested in setting up a support program. I do want to make a general offer. You guys are in-house, you're in system with us. The Burkhart Center is happy to be a resource for you. And I know that our college support program, CASE, Connections for Academic Success and Employment, that staff loves to talk to other folks setting up programs like this, because we have not learned everything there is to know. We are not the experts in this game. Even though we've been going 7-8 years now, all that's shown us is we've got a long way yet to go. So please reach out. If you're interested in making connection, if you want to come visit us, we actually have one of our learning specialists down there in San Angelo right now. I think she's working for the university. I know she would love to come talk about things. Please reach out. Shoot me an email. I'll put you in touch with our program. We are more than happy to visit with people, problem solve, talk about supports. I also want to encourage you, I'll just do a plug here at the end real quick. We do a thing every spring called the Higher Ed Think Tank, where we invite programs supporting students with autism or people working with college students with autism to come to Texas Tech for 2 days. Over the last couple of years, we've had over 14 different programs from the state of Texas and a number of programs nationally come to our think tank. We spend time describing our program, but we also set up a lot of time to talk and share with each other about things that work and things that we've learned and mistakes that we've made. And that's an amazing opportunity for those of you who want to maybe more formally learn how to support folks on the spectrum, to come to meet your people, come to meet the other folks struggling with these things, and celebrating these things and seeing the successes. Because, you know, I tell a lot of stories, but we've got a lot of stories of success too. I say that this is the next problem. 20 years ago, we were trying to figure out how to keep people with autism in school and in home. And now we're talking about how do I get them degrees and careers and jobs. And so these struggles means we've been doing it right. That you have more students with autism in your classes means we're doing it right. And now we want to make sure you all feel supported enough to keep giving those students those opportunities. So I just want to say thanks. Thanks for doing this work. Thanks for coming to this presentation. Thanks for what you're doing for your students and for being the students and for leaning into this. We want to keep getting to know you. We want to keep helping. So please reach out if you have other questions or if there's ever anything else we can do to help. You're in the Texas Tech system, so you're under the Burkhart umbrella in terms of the ability to ask for these trainings. I will tell you, since I got questions from different groups, we are happy at no charge to do trainings like this for groups. I've trained RAs. I've talked to the counseling center. I've trained tutors. I've trained the health center staff. I've trained academic departments. If you have a group that you think, man, I wish my coworkers or colleagues could hear the same thing, please reach out. I'm always happy to jump on another webinar or have another of my staff members jump in and give you guys whatever knowledge we can share.